That's the concentration on that little corner of woods you can see on your map. He'll adjust from there. Lieutenant Reed reached for the telephone and called for concentration. We waited anxiously for the sound of the big guns going off behind us. Then it came, and the big shells whistled over our heads. We could hear them exploding in the distance beyond the town. That was 200 right. Lieutenant Reed repeated the correction over the telephone, and we waited again for the sound of the big guns. 2 TDs roared into town from the south, and I sent Private First Class Harry Zellin of Manhattan, New York, one of the platoon runners, to guide them to the patch of firs to provide supporting fire if possible. The artillery whistled overhead and exploded again in the distance. "How was that?" I asked. "Almost right in there," Campbell replied. "Butwina says reduce the range 50 yards and let him have it again. I'm going to adjust after that, and he's going to try to get back to his squad. He's taking my radio. It's got better batteries." "Roger," I answered and repeated the sensing to Lieutenant Reed. We heard the whistle of the shells and the explosions. A long pause followed before Campbell gave us the sensing. "Butwina has started back to his squad," he said, "and I just had a call from him. He says to hold the artillery. Something screwy's taking place. A German just came out of the woods with one of his scouts." We waited impatiently for a report on the situation. 5, 10, 15 minutes passed. Finally, it came. "This is Campbell, Captain," the radio said. "I just got another call from Butwina. He says the Germans are bringing out our wounded man, and he's sending one man back with 20 prisoners. The rest of them are going on through the woods." I didn't know what had taken place, but I did know that the patrol was safe now, and that was all that mattered for the moment. The wounded man was Private First Class Michael Wapner. He had received a serious wound in the side, but the aid men thought he would come through it all right. The patrol returned shortly before noon, reporting the trail through the woods to Neustadt, the town beyond the ridge, was clear. I pieced together a complete picture of the action after talking with Sergeant Butwina and Sergeant Gettel, who, although he was assistant squad leader, had insisted upon being one of the scouts. Sergeant Gettel and Private First Class Wapner had been almost inside the woods when the Germans opened fire from dug-in positions on the edge of the forest. Wapner was hit with the first burst. After the first excitement died down, Gettel made his way to where Wapner lay to assist him. The Germans in the woods saw the situation and held their fire. A German aid man came out and helped Sergeant Gettel carry the wounded man to one of the foxholes in the woods, where the aid man dressed the wound. Sergeant Gettel knew a few words of German and began to insist to the enemy lieutenant that he and his 19 men surrender. The first artillery barrage brought a weakening in the lieutenant's attitude. He began to shake from fright, and Gettel seized the opportunity to pour on the sales talk. The second barrage was almost on top of them, but the lieutenant still did not give in. It was the third barrage that impelled him to surrender, and they moved out of the woods to contact the patrol and have the artillery fire lifted. The remainder of the day and night passed quietly. I half expected a call from battalion at any time to report to receive the attack order, but I hoped vainly that the various reports of enemy surrenders en masse in other sectors would forestall the attack in the hope of a large-scale surrender in Czechoslovakia. But I was called to battalion the next afternoon, May 5th. Colonel Smith outlined the plan. F Company would attack immediately to take Godruch, the little town that lay beside the woods near the church beyond Monsieur Dvorsay. As soon as the town was ours, I would send one reinforced rifle platoon to take over its defence for the night, sending a patrol through the woods to investigate a trail leading from Godruch to Neustadt. The main attack would come slightly before dawn the next morning with G and E companies in the assault echelon. G Company's first objective would be Neustadt. F Company laid down a deafening artillery barrage against the little town of Godruch and took it without a show of resistance, although the town yielded 75 prisoners. At least half the houses in the town went up in flames from the murderous artillery barrage, and the civilians were dashing madly here and there in an effort to put out the fires when I arrived with the 3rd platoon to take over the town. F Company withdrew, and Sergeant Barnes dispatched a patrol to investigate the trail through the woods. I waited in the town until almost dark for the return of the patrol. They reported that the trail through the woods was clear. Captain Bird called from battalion soon after dark. The news about the burning of Godruch had evidently spread among the other villages to the east. The burgomeister of one of the villages had come into the 3rd Battalion's lines and begged that we stop the artillery, claiming there were no soldiers in his town. The officers of the battalion told him to return and spread the information to all the towns in the area. If they displayed white flags prominently from every house and kept the German troops from firing at us when we attacked the next morning, there would be no artillery. I could not avoid comparing the situation, in which we told the Germans when we would attack, with the hectic winter campaign when surprise was an important element. It was dark when I left with the headquarters group and the 1st and 2nd platoons for Godruch the next morning, but it was daylight before we had completed details for the attack. We were getting into formation to move on through the woods when 3 soldiers in Polish uniforms stepped from the woods. I turned the 3 Poles over to Colonel Smith and Captain Bird when they arrived. They said they were a patrol sent out by their regiment of 1,000 men who had been fighting with the Germans against the Russians, but now wished to arrange for a surrender to the Americans. They were fully armed and in bivouac 25 miles to the east. The 3rd platoon led our march through the woods along the trail in a close march formation. The woods were dense, and I expected at any moment to hear the sound of small arms fire that would mean defenders had moved in during the night, but we progressed without difficulty. The lead platoons halted at the edge of the woods on a hill overlooking the objective in a broad valley below us. To take the town, we must cross 600 yards of open field to a raised railroad track which ran along the edge of the town and was ideal for defence. On a road which entered the town from the northwest, we could see German soldiers working on an anti-tank roadblock. We set up the machine guns on the hill, and Sergeant Barnes dispatched 1 squad down the open slope toward the town. If they ran into trouble, we would attempt to level the town with artillery before moving in. The Germans constructing the roadblock saw the patrol squad and stopped their work to watch, but there was no sound of fire. The squad took the most direct route to the railroad track in an effort to reach the cover it provided before entering the town. I gave the machine gunners orders not to fire until I should give the signal. I could see no white flags in Neustadt, but perhaps the Germans would not fire if we did not fire first. 1 shot might set off a blaze of enemy fireworks. The machine gunners wanted to open fire on German soldiers running and riding bicycles up the sloping hill beyond the town, but the range was too great for their fire to be effective, and I feared the risk of the enemy opening fire. The battalion staff arrived on the hill, however, and Colonel Smith overrode my objections to firing the machine guns. I did not object because I saw the men from the patrol squad had reached the railroad tracks, and 4 Germans jumped up from their foxholes and surrendered. I knew the town was ours. The other 2 squads from the 3rd platoon started down the hill, and the 1st platoon followed. The 6 machine guns chattered, their tracers spanning the town in a great fiery arc to burn themselves into the hill beyond. Lieutenant Reed called for artillery on the fleeing Germans. An enemy machine gun opened up suddenly from the railroad tracks to the right front. The fire was high over our heads and did no damage, but the battalion staff cleared the hill as if by magic. The enemy gunner fired another burst, and I told our own machine gunners to cease firing, almost grateful to the enemy gunner who had fired and cleared the hill of the battalion staff. I moved down the forward slope of the hill with the remainder of the company, wary lest the enemy gunner open up again, but I found 2 men from the 3rd platoon at the railroad track covering the enemy gunner and trying to talk him into surrendering. I left a mortar squad with the 2 riflemen for the purpose of persuasion and continued into the town. Colonel Smith reappeared in the village to tell me that we should continue the attack to take the next town of Gorstjevonitz 2 miles to the east and be prepared to continue to the next 2 towns. The order was not much of a surprise. I knew that once we had begun the limited objective attack, we would keep rolling. When we reached the open crest of the hill, we could see the steeple of the church in the little town that was our objective. The machine gunners set up again, and the 3rd platoon rushed the remaining distance to the first houses. The other platoons followed, and I allowed the machine gunners to open up on stray Germans moving around in the valley below us. I followed the platoons into the town, and the men rounded up 90 Germans, members of a Labour battalion. The 3rd platoon medic found a Russian girl in one of the houses. She began to sob violently, and the medic comforted her with his arms around her. He looked at me and winked. "She says she had heard that the Americans were coming," the medic said, "and she thought she would be so happy that she would laugh forever. But now that we're here, she says she's so happy she has to cry." The platoons set up their defences for the night, and battalion ordered me to send a patrol to the next town atop a hill at the end of the valley. Staff Sergeant John H. Winter of Edgewood, Rhode Island, led the patrol of 6 men from the 2nd platoon shortly after dark, but they returned in 3 hours with the news that they had entered the town and found no resistance. E and F companies jumped off the next morning in the attack, but reports filtering back to us over the battalion radio told us that nowhere was there any resistance. F Company took 300 prisoners soon after starting out, and found the antique 75mm horse-drawn piece which had fired the evening before. We followed far behind the assault companies and cleared 2 towns which they had bypassed, but there was no resistance. We reached the pillboxes which had been the old Czechoslovakian defence against Germany, but they were unoccupied. Regiment ordered battalion to load up on tanks and trucks and continue the assault as rapidly as possible. Resistance had collapsed all along the regimental front. The 3rd Battalion had taken the Polish regiment, and the 16th Armoured Division had been committed on the highway to our left to take Pilsen. We loaded on trucks and moved forward, and soon the highway was a confused mass of vehicles. As our column advanced down one side of the highway, a ragged column of Germans in horse-drawn wagons, dilapidated German army vehicles, civilian automobiles, bicycles, and on foot, met us coming down the other side. Some had their families with them. All had thrown away their weapons. We could not keep from laughing. The German column was so pathetic that it was funny, and also we knew that it must mean the end of the war. The Germans were running from the Russians to surrender to the Americans. This was the last front in Europe, other than the Russian front, and now resistance here had ended. The traffic became almost a hopeless mass of milling people. Regiment would take no more prisoners of war. Division said their POW cages were overflowing and would accept no more from regiment. It was up to the battalion to handle the prisoners for the night. Colonel Smith assigned a platoon from E Company to guard them, and more than 1,000 assembled in a large open field, not including the 1,500 who had already been sent to regiment. Our column continued forward, and my company shifted to the lead position on tanks. I rode behind the lead tank in the artillery jeep. The little country towns changed into small industrial towns, and we began to notice a scattering of red, white, and blue Czechoslovakian flags in the towns, in place of the usual white flags of surrender. Civilians waved at us guardedly from behind closed windows. The scattering of Czech flags should have warned us, but we were totally unprepared for the mad celebration which greeted us in the next town. We had suddenly crossed from the Sudetenland into Czechoslovakia proper. The houses were a riot of colour with red, white and blue Czechoslovakian flags. Civilians lined the streets 10 deep, cheering and waving their flags as if their lives depended upon it. Our column was forced to slow down, and the happy civilians pushed into the street and showered us with flowers and cakes and cookies. One old woman thrust a baked chicken into our jeep. Another old woman stood beside the road waving both hands in the air, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. Little children were wild with joy. Some of them had never known anything but 6 years of Nazi occupation. The young men wore red, white and blue armbands and carried German weapons, a part of the underground movement that was even now struggling against superior German forces in the capital city of Prague. Everyone was screaming the Czech words, "Nazdar! Nazdar!" and we wondered what they meant. I looked up and down the column at the soldiers in the company. Brilliant smiles wreathed their faces, and they waved cheerfully at the shouting crowds as if they had just won an election campaign, and this was a personal triumph. Hardened, stubble-faced veterans had unashamed tears in their eyes. The unleashed joy of these oppressed people knew no bounds, and it was too much for us. Suddenly, I began to realize what no one had thus far been able in the war to put into words, what we were fighting for, and I found a lump in my throat which I could not swallow. Colonel Smith radioed for us to turn south to the small town of Uhitse for the night. We were reluctant to leave the cheering crowds, but we moved once again into the country and entered Uhitse. The town was predominantly German, so the welcome was subdued, but the few Czechs in the town were overcome with gratitude. Little children gathered around our vehicles asking for chewing gum and candy, as they had in every European country we had visited. We moved out again the next morning on foot, and in every town the throngs of cheering civilians lined the streets in a spontaneous celebration that had lost none of its fervour with the passing of night. Children dressed in the gay national Czech costumes, old women and old men, pretty young girls, and the young men with the red, white and blue armbands cheered us lustily. Our faces became set in answering smiles, and our arms ached from waving back. We were showered with cakes and cookies, and soldiers carried small paper Czech flags in the muzzles of their rifles and bouquets of wildflowers in their hands. We passed batteries of 88 flak guns that I knew had been protection for the vast Skoda works in Pilsen, and I could not help but shudder at the sight of the big guns. Even in their helpless state without crews, they were frightening. We swung to the north and came again to the main highway into Pilsen, and the road was lined with armoured vehicles speeding into the city. The city had fallen, and veteran war correspondents were describing the welcome as exceeding that at the liberation of Paris. The battalion halted in Krumice on the main highway, and we waited among admiring crowds for further orders. Pretty girls appeared suddenly with 2nd Division shoulder patches sewed to their sweaters, and others appeared with patches from the 16th Armoured. Someone said that combat action in Europe was over for our division. We laughed. Another rumour. No, we should cease all forward movement. The news was from regiment. It was official. We shook hands wildly, and soldiers did impromptu dances around the jeeps and patted one another on the back. Sergeant Quinn said, "Take out the cognac!" Colonel Smith stopped by my company and told me to climb into his jeep. He was going into Pilsen. The city was the same cheering, enthusiastic, grateful mass of liberated people as the small towns on the route, only on a larger scale. The streets were packed. Civilians clambered over all the big armoured vehicles, and soldiers hugged and kissed beautiful girls, while old men and women roared approval. Czech flags were everywhere, with a scattering of flags with hammer and sickle on a red background. A few buildings displayed elaborate Czech, Russian, British and American flags, but the civilians were obviously unprepared for liberation by Americans. They had expected the Russians to get there first. But the festive spirit was not dampened in the least by the lack of proper American flags. It was carnival, it was festival, it was liberation. The orders had been received when we returned to Krumice, and G Company was to move a mile to the northeast to the modern little town of Radzice. As we moved on foot toward the town, old men and women working in the fields saw us coming and dropped their work to run to meet us, grasping us around the neck and kissing us on both cheeks, tears of gratitude streaming down their faces. The town was ready for us when we arrived. Little boys and girls preceded their elders and ran to meet our column, thrusting bouquets of flowers into our hands and shouting, "Nazdar! Nazdar!" When the excitement had died down and one of the Slavic-speaking men in the company explained that we wished billets for the night, I was besieged by requests for soldiers to stay in various homes. I found myself unable to consider the tactical disposition of the company. Soldiers scattered in all directions, hustled along by the enthusiastic civilians. I found the lump in my throat bigger than ever. The news came by radio that the war was over. There was no defining our joy. Sergeant Quinn brought out the treasured keg of cognac. The next day, May 8th, would be VE Day. The townspeople in Radzice held a dance for us the next night in the town guest house. One of the artillerymen was escorting a young girl whom he had met the night before, and she had told him that her friend, Labour, would like very much to attend with the captain. The small guest house was crowded with dancers, and the older men and women sat with the young children at tables around the sides of the room. The male dancers were predominantly GIs, but a few Czech young men were present. The orchestra reminded me of the circus bands in the US as they played the waltzes, polkas, and mazurkas. The Czechs would often join in, singing the songs enthusiastically even as they danced. At the insistence of the band leader, Liebe agreed to sing, and the notes came forth in a clear, sparkling soprano. When she had finished, she made a brief speech, which the Slavic-speaking soldier told me was about how the people would now sing their national anthem. It would be the first time they had sung it in public in 6 years. The people rose as one, and every boy, girl, man and woman joined in the singing with clear, lusty voices that made goosebumps rise on my arms. Some of the older people cried, and it was all I could do to keep the tears from my eyes. When the song ended, the orchestra struck up a rousing tune which my interpreter told me was the equivalent of our own "For He's a Jolly Good Fellow," and they were singing it for me. I felt warm and foolish inside, and I wanted to leave the room, but then I realized that they were singing to me only as a symbol for all the men in the company. The band broke into a fast polka, and the floor suddenly cleared of dancers. This dance, I was told, was for me. I should choose a girl and dance the number alone. I felt very self-conscious as I motioned to Liebe, and we moved out on the dance floor. But I found myself imitating Liebe's spinning turns and gay, vivacious laughter. The others in the room formed a large circle around us and beat time to the music with their hands. When it was over, the soldiers began to cry, "Speech! Speech!" and the civilians caught on and applauded. I stood upon a chair in the centre of the room, trying to think of something to say. I mumbled a few words of sincere gratitude for the wonderful reception these wonderful people had given us. A soldier translated for Liebe, and she told the people what I had said. They applauded warmly. Liebe and I walked outside into the cool night air. In the distance we could see fireworks exploding in the air above Pilsen, and we knew that they too were celebrating VE Day. I looked around me and saw the light streaming from the windows, and army vehicles driving on the highway with their headlights on. I heard the gay music and laughter from the dance in the background. I suddenly realized that I could light a cigarette once again in the open and not be afraid of drawing enemy fire, and I did. It was a simple thing, but it gave me a wonderful feeling that life was worth living again. I put my arm about Liebe's waist, and she pointed to the multicoloured fireworks display and laughed. "Dobry! Dobry!" I had learned that Dobry meant good, and I said, "Dobry, Dobry." I looked away into the distance, and I seemed to see the faces of the men from Companies Y and G who could not see this great day because they had died to obtain it. And then their faces were gone, and I saw the mud and ice and snow of the Siegfried Line, and the exploding fireworks became bursting artillery shells in the Ardennes and bursting flak at Leipzig. But then the terror was gone, and I saw 2 companies of men marching by, and there was I Company and G Company, tired, dirty, weary, but with smiling faces. Somehow the faces of the men who had been killed were in the background, smiling and waving bravely to those who marched on. Liebe looked up at me as if to ask what I was thinking, and I said, "Dobry, Dobry," and Liebe squeezed my hand and laughed. "Yes, Dobry, Dobry." And that is the end of my story. But perhaps you would like to know that my company moved on 5 miles north of Pilsen to Tremosna, and there we met another group of tired, dirty infantrymen who called themselves Russians. A month later, we were loaded on a big boat at Le Havre, and on July 20th, 1945, we sailed into New York Harbor and received the cheers of a grateful America, and saw a tall lady with a torch that brought tears to our eyes. The characters in my story were destined to be sent to help finish another war in another part of the world, where another group of American infantrymen were fighting a dirty, miserable war. But a miracle happened, and the other war came to an end. Most of my characters are wearing civilian clothes again now, but I know that wherever they are, they have a hollow place in their hearts for those who will not be changing to civilian clothes again, ever. Those G.I. Joes who, so that others might live, themselves became the fallen fruit of a harvest for the devil.